The blood still stains the stones of Tenochtitlan's great temple. Archaeologists have found it after 500 years, layers upon layers of human sacrifice that fed the Aztec Empire's hunger for divine favor. But was this brutality the price of a just rule, or the mark of a corrupt system that needed to fall? The question haunts historians today, just as it haunted the Spanish conquistadors who first witnessed these rituals in 1519. Long before Hernán Cortés set foot on Mexican soil, the Aztec Empire had already established itself as one of history's most complex civilizations. The story begins in 1325, when a small group of nomadic Mexica people founded their capital city on an island in Lake Texcoco. According to legend, they saw an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake, the sign their god Huitzilopochtli had promised them. This divine mandate would shape everything that followed. The Aztec people quickly transformed from outsiders into rulers. They built causeways that connected their island city to the mainland. They created floating gardens called chinampas that fed thousands. They developed a writing system, a complex calendar, and mathematical knowledge that rivaled European achievements. But expansion required more than engineering skills. The Aztecs needed warriors, they needed tribute, they needed fear. In 1428, 3 city-states formed an alliance that would dominate central Mexico for nearly a century. Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan joined forces not out of friendship but necessity. Each brought something essential to the table. Tenochtitlan provided military might and religious fervor. Texcoco contributed intellectual leadership and diplomatic skills. Tlacopan offered strategic positioning and local knowledge. Together, they became unstoppable. The alliance's first major victory came against Azcapotzalco, their former overlords. This conquest established a pattern that would repeat for decades. The Aztecs would defeat an enemy, absorb their warriors, and incorporate their territories into an expanding tribute system. Itzcoatl, the first great ruler of Tenochtitlan, led this transformation. He reformed the government, expanded the military, and began the systematic conquest of neighboring peoples. His nephew and successor, Moctezuma I, continued this work with ruthless efficiency. Aztec expansion came at a terrible cost to conquered peoples. Every defeated city had to pay tribute: gold, silver, textiles, food, and human captives. The tribute system was so efficient that Tenochtitlan grew to become one of the world's largest cities with over 200,000 inhabitants. But tribute was only part of the equation. The Aztecs also demanded human sacrifices. These weren't random acts of violence. They were religious ceremonies designed to keep the sun moving across the sky and prevent the end of the world. The numbers are staggering. During the dedication of the Great Temple in 1487, the Aztecs sacrificed an estimated 20,000 people over 4 days. Some estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands died in these rituals during the empire's height. Conquered peoples had no choice in the matter. Refuse to provide captives, and your city would face complete destruction. Comply, and you became part of the Aztec tribute system, a system that enriched the capital while keeping subject peoples in constant fear. Aztec leaders genuinely believed they were fulfilling a divine purpose. Their gods had created the world through sacrifice. The sun itself moved because previous gods had given their lives to keep it going. Human sacrifice was simply the continuation of this cosmic order. This wasn't unique to the Aztecs. Many Mesoamerican civilizations practiced human sacrifice. What made the Aztecs different was the scale and organization of their rituals. They turned sacrifice into a state religion with complete, elaborate ceremonies, specialized priests, and massive temples. The Aztec worldview was cyclical. They believed in multiple ages of creation and destruction. The current age, the fifth sun, could end at any moment if the gods weren't properly fed. Sacrifice wasn't just about maintaining power, it was about saving the world. This belief system created a moral framework that justified extreme violence. Captives weren't murdered, they were honored guests who would join the gods in the afterlife. Warriors who captured enemies were heroes. Priests who performed sacrifices were holy men serving the highest purpose. But not everyone accepted this justification. Archaeological evidence shows that many conquered peoples actively resisted Aztec rule. Some cities paid tribute while secretly preparing for rebellion. Others formed alliances with the Aztecs' enemies, waiting for the chance to strike. The Tarascans in western Mexico successfully resisted Aztec expansion for decades. Their secret? Superior metallurgy and organized resistance. They never became part of the tribute system, never provided captives for sacrifice, and never submitted to Aztec religious practices. Even within the empire, tensions simmered. Subject peoples were required to send their best warriors to fight in Aztec wars. These warriors often died in battles that served Aztec interests, not their own. Over time, resentment built into a powder keg of discontent. The Aztecs tried to manage this resistance through a combination of terror and rewards. Loyal allies received favorable trade agreements and military support. Unruly subjects faced destruction and enslavement. But this system required constant attention and resources. Several individuals shaped the moral landscape of the Aztec Empire. Tlacaelel, the chief advisor to multiple rulers, reformed Aztec religion to justify imperial expansion. He ordered the burning of conquered people's books and histories, ensuring that only Aztec versions of events would survive. Ahuitzotl, who ruled from 1486 to 1502, expanded the empire to its greatest extent. He was also responsible for the massive sacrifice during the Great Temple's dedication. His military campaigns brought thousands of captives to Tenochtitlan's altars. Moctezuma II, the ruler when the Spanish arrived, faced an impossible situation. He had to maintain the tribute system while dealing with a new threat that didn't fit into traditional Aztec categories. The Spanish came not as enemies to be conquered, but as something entirely different. Cortés himself was a product of Spanish colonial ambitions. He arrived in Mexico seeking gold, glory, and God. His justification for conquest was religious, spreading Christianity and saving souls. But his methods were equally brutal, if not more so. The meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés on November 8, 1519, marked a turning point in world history. Both men believed they were dealing with divine figures. Moctezuma thought Cortés might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl. Cortés saw himself as God's instrument for spreading Christianity. This mutual misunderstanding had tragic consequences. Moctezuma welcomed the Spanish into Tenochtitlan, hoping to learn more about these strange newcomers. Cortés took advantage of this hospitality to capture the Aztec ruler and seize control of the capital. The Spanish didn't immediately destroy the Aztec Empire. They tried to rule through Moctezuma, using his authority to collect tribute and maintain order. But this arrangement collapsed when Spanish soldiers massacred Aztec nobles during a religious festival. The people of Tenochtitlan rose up in rebellion. The Spanish fled the city on June 30, 1520, a night known as La Noche Triste, the sad night. Cortés lost most of his men and much of his equipment, but he didn't give up. He regrouped, formed alliances with Aztec enemies, and returned to besiege Tenochtitlan. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted 80 days. During this time, the Spanish and their indigenous allies systematically destroyed the city that had dominated central Mexico for over a century. They cut off food supplies, bombarded the city with cannons, and killed thousands of civilians. Cortés claimed he was bringing justice to a people who had been oppressed by Aztec tyranny. His indigenous allies, particularly the Tlaxcalans, had suffered under Aztec tribute demands for generations. They saw the Spanish as liberators, not conquerors. But the Spanish treatment of the defeated Aztecs was brutal beyond any reasonable measure of justice. They tortured Moctezuma to death, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. They destroyed Aztec temples and books, erasing centuries of accumulated knowledge. They enslaved survivors and forced them to work in Spanish mines and plantations. The Spanish conquest wasn't a simple story of European superiority overcoming indigenous barbarism. Many factors contributed to Aztec defeat that had nothing to do with moral justification. Disease played the largest role. Smallpox, measles, and other European diseases killed millions of indigenous people who had no immunity. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the native population died from disease within a century of contact. This demographic collapse made resistance nearly impossible. Climate change also weakened the Aztecs. A severe drought in the early 1500s reduced agricultural production and increased social tensions. Famine made people more susceptible to disease and less able to resist Spanish advances. The Aztecs also made strategic mistakes. Moctezuma's initial hospitality gave the Spanish time to gather intelligence and form alliances. The Aztecs' focus on capturing enemies rather than killing them allowed Spanish soldiers to survive battles that should have been fatal.
The question of whether Aztec rule was justified depends on whose perspective you take. From the Aztec point of view, they were maintaining cosmic order and fulfilling divine commands. Their tribute system provided stability and prosperity for millions of people. Their religious practices were no more extreme than those of contemporary European societies. From the perspective of conquered peoples, Aztec rule was a nightmare of oppression and violence. The tribute demands impoverished entire regions. The sacrifice rituals terrorized populations. The military campaigns disrupted trade and destroyed cities. From the Spanish perspective, they were liberating oppressed peoples and spreading Christianity. But their methods were equally brutal, if not more so. They destroyed indigenous civilizations with no regard for local customs or beliefs. They enslaved survivors and forced them to adopt European ways. The fall of the Aztec Empire had consequences that echo to this day. The Spanish conquest introduced new diseases, animals, and crops that transformed the Americas forever. They also brought new forms of government, religion, and social organization that replaced indigenous systems. Millions of indigenous people died from disease, warfare, and slavery. Those who survived faced forced conversion to Christianity and loss of their traditional ways of life. Spanish colonial rule established a rigid caste system that privileged Europeans over indigenous peoples and Africans. But the conquest also created new possibilities. The mixing of European, indigenous, and African peoples created new cultures and identities. The Spanish brought technologies and ideas that indigenous peoples adapted and improved. New forms of art, literature, and architecture emerged from this cultural mixing. Today, historians debate whether the Aztec Empire was more or less just than the Spanish colonial system that replaced it. Some argue that the Aztec tribute system was actually more efficient and less destructive than European feudalism. Others point to the massive scale of human sacrifice as evidence of fundamental moral corruption. Others suggest that both systems were products of their time and cannot be judged by modern standards. Archaeological discoveries continue to complicate this picture. Recent excavations have revealed the sophistication of Aztec urban planning, agriculture, and government. They've also uncovered evidence of resistance and rebellion that suggest many people rejected Aztec authority. The moral questions raised by the Aztec-Spanish encounter remain relevant today. How do we judge historical societies by modern standards? Can conquest ever be justified? What responsibilities do powerful nations have toward weaker ones? The ethics of empire remain unresolved because they involve competing claims and values. The Aztecs believed they were saving the world through sacrifice. Their enemies believed they were suffering under unjust oppression. The Spanish believed they were spreading civilization and Christianity. Indigenous allies believed they were gaining freedom from Aztec tyranny. Each perspective contains elements of truth and justification. Each also contains elements of self-interest and rationalization. The challenge for modern observers is to understand these different viewpoints without imposing our own moral frameworks. The Aztec Empire was neither purely evil nor purely good. It was a complex system that provided benefits to some while imposing costs on others. The Spanish conquest was neither purely liberating nor purely destructive. It brought new opportunities while destroying existing ones. The encounter between Aztec and Spanish civilizations offers lessons for understanding modern conflicts and power relationships. It shows how different moral frameworks can lead to irreconcilable differences. It demonstrates how technological and biological advantages can determine the outcome of conflicts, regardless of justice or morality. It also shows the importance of understanding other cultures on their own terms. The Spanish failure to understand Aztec religion and politics contributed to unnecessary violence and destruction. Modern conflicts often suffer from similar failures of understanding and communication. The legacy of this encounter continues to shape relationships between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. Questions of justice, sovereignty, and cultural preservation remain as relevant today as they were 500 years ago. Historians continue to debate the ethics of Aztec rule and Spanish conquest. New archaeological discoveries provide fresh evidence that challenges old assumptions. Indigenous voices that were previously silenced are now being heard and valued. Some scholars argue that the Aztec tribute system was actually more efficient and less destructive than European feudalism. Others point to the massive scale of human sacrifice as evidence of fundamental moral corruption. Still others suggest that both systems were products of their time and cannot be judged by modern standards.
The debate matters because it affects how we understand the past and approach the future. If we see the Aztec Empire as purely evil, we might justify any means of opposing similar systems today. If we see it as fundamentally just, we might be more tolerant of authoritarian rule. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The question of whether Aztec rule was justified has no simple answer. The Aztecs created a sophisticated civilization that provided stability and prosperity for millions of people. They also practiced rituals that seem barbaric by modern standards. Their enemies suffered under tribute demands and sacrifice requirements. Their allies benefited from protection and trade opportunities. The Spanish conquest ended Aztec rule, but replaced it with a system that was arguably more destructive and exploitative. Millions died from disease and violence. Indigenous cultures were suppressed and destroyed. New forms of oppression emerged that lasted for centuries. What we can say with certainty is that power corrupts, that different cultures have different moral frameworks, and that the winners of conflicts often write the history books. The Aztec-Spanish encounter reminds us that justice is complicated and that simple moral judgments rarely capture the full complexity of human behavior. The blood that stains the stones of Tenochtitlan's temple represents not just Aztec brutality, but the universal human capacity for violence in the name of higher purposes. Whether that violence can ever be justified remains one of history's most enduring questions. Perhaps the real lesson is not whether the Aztecs were right or wrong, but how we can create systems of governance that minimize suffering while maximizing human flourishing. The debate continues, as it should. The answers matter, even if they remain elusive. And the search for truth about our past helps us build a better future for all peoples, regardless of their origins or beliefs. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all. Recent archaeological work has revealed new insights into Aztec society that complicate our understanding of their rule. Excavations beneath modern Mexico City have uncovered evidence of sophisticated urban planning, advanced agricultural techniques, and extensive trade networks. The Aztecs built a city that was larger and more complex than any European city of its time. These discoveries suggest that Aztec rule provided real benefits to millions of people. The tribute system wasn't just exploitation, it also facilitated trade, technology transfer, and cultural exchange. Many conquered peoples adopted Aztec innovations in agriculture, architecture, and governance. But archaeology has also confirmed the scale of Aztec violence. Mass graves containing hundreds of sacrificed individuals have been found throughout the empire. Some victims were children, some were warriors, and some were nobles from conquered cities. The evidence shows that human sacrifice was not just religious ritual, but also political tool. Modern economic historians have analyzed the Aztec tribute system and found it surprisingly efficient. The empire maintained detailed records of production, trade, and taxation. Tribute payments were proportional to local wealth and productive capacity. This system provided stable revenue for the capital while allowing subject peoples to maintain their local customs and leadership. The Aztec economy was more sophisticated than previously thought. They used standardized currency, maintained extensive trade networks, and developed specialized industries. Many conquered peoples actually prospered under Aztec rule, particularly merchants and artisans who benefited from expanded markets and goods. However, the system also created dependencies that made subject peoples vulnerable to exploitation. Tribute demands increased over time as the empire expanded. Local leaders often had to choose between meeting Aztec demands and maintaining their own population's welfare. Understanding Aztec religion requires placing it in its historical and cultural context. Human sacrifice was practiced throughout Mesoamerica long before the Aztecs arrived. The Maya, Zapotec, and other civilizations all engaged in similar rituals. What made the Aztecs different was the scale and organization of their practices. Aztec religious beliefs were genuinely held convictions, not mere rationalizations for violence. Archaeological evidence shows that rulers and commoners alike participated in religious ceremonies. Priests were highly educated and respected members of society. The sacrifice rituals were complex ceremonies that involved the entire community. The Aztec worldview was shaped by centuries of warfare and environmental challenges. Their gods demanded sacrifice because the world itself had been created through divine self-sacrifice. This wasn't primitive superstition, but a coherent theological system that explained their place in the cosmos. Comparing Aztec rule to contemporary European systems reveals surprising similarities. European feudalism also involved tribute payments, forced labor, and religious justification for political authority. The Catholic Church supported monarchs who engaged in warfare, slavery, and persecution of religious minorities. Spanish colonial rule in the Americas was arguably more brutal than Aztec domination. The encomienda system enslaved indigenous peoples and forced them to work in mines under horrific conditions. Disease and violence killed millions of people who had done nothing wrong. The moral frameworks of different civilizations were products of their historical circumstances. The Aztecs lived in a world of constant warfare, where survival required military strength and religious unity. Europeans lived in a world of expanding trade and technological innovation that created different possibilities and challenges.
Recent scholarship has recovered indigenous perspectives on the Aztec-Spanish encounter that were previously ignored or suppressed. Nahuatl language sources reveal that many conquered peoples welcomed the Spanish as liberators from Aztec oppression.
Others saw the Spanish as just another group of foreigners who'd eventually be driven out. Indigenous allies played crucial roles in the Spanish conquest. The Tlaxcalans provided thousands of warriors who fought alongside Spanish forces. Without indigenous support, the Spanish never could have defeated the Aztec Empire. These alliances were based on genuine grievances against Aztec rule, not European manipulation. But indigenous sources also reveal resistance to Spanish colonialism. Many people who initially supported the Spanish turned against them when they realized that Spanish rule was even more oppressive than Aztec domination. Indigenous rebellions continued for decades after the fall of Tenochtitlan. Environmental conditions played a crucial role in shaping both Aztec society and Spanish conquest. The Aztecs developed sophisticated water management systems to support their island city. They created artificial islands and canals that maximized agricultural production in a challenging environment. Climate change in the early 1500s weakened the Aztec Empire just as the Spanish arrived. Drought reduced agricultural yields and increased social tensions. Disease outbreaks were more devastating because populations were already weakened by malnutrition and stress. The Spanish benefited from environmental factors that had nothing to do with moral superiority. European diseases that were harmless to Europeans were deadly to indigenous peoples who had no immunity. This biological advantage was as important as military technology in determining the outcome of conflicts. The technological gap between Aztec and Spanish was smaller than commonly assumed. Aztec weapons and armor were sophisticated and effective against other indigenous peoples. Their military tactics were well adapted to local conditions and terrain. Spanish advantages came from specific technologies that were particularly effective in the Mexican environment. Steel weapons could penetrate Aztec armor more easily than obsidian blades. Horses provided mobility that was impossible for infantry-based armies. Cannons could destroy Aztec fortifications that had never faced artillery. But technology alone didn't determine the outcome. Spanish success depended on forming alliances with indigenous peoples, who provided most of the manpower for the conquest. Without indigenous support, Spanish technological advantages would have been meaningless. The encounter between Aztec and Spanish civilizations involved more than conflict and destruction. Cultural exchange enriched both societies in ways that are still being discovered. Spanish adopted indigenous foods, medicines, and agricultural techniques that transformed European society. Indigenous peoples incorporated European technologies, animals, and crops into their existing systems. Horses revolutionized transportation and warfare. European wheat and livestock provided new food sources. Metal tools improved productivity in many industries. This cultural mixing created new identities and communities that were neither purely indigenous nor purely European. The mestizo population that emerged from this encounter became the foundation of modern Mexican society. Their experiences challenged simple narratives of conquest and colonization. The fall of the Aztec Empire had consequences that extended far beyond Mexico. The Spanish conquest provided gold and silver that financed European expansion and industrial development. Indigenous knowledge of agriculture, medicine, and natural resources contributed to European scientific advancement. But the conquest also established patterns of exploitation and oppression that lasted for centuries. The colonial system created racial hierarchies that privileged Europeans over indigenous peoples and Africans. These hierarchies shaped social, economic, and political development throughout the Americas. The demographic collapse caused by disease and violence had global consequences. The loss of millions of indigenous workers disrupted local economies and forced European colonizers to import African slaves. This created the transatlantic slave trade that shaped the development of the Americas for centuries. The ethical questions raised by the Aztec-Spanish encounter remain relevant to contemporary debates about power, justice, and cultural difference. Modern conflicts often involve competing claims about legitimacy, sovereignty, and human rights. Understanding how these issues played out in the past can inform how we approach them today. The concept of humanitarian intervention has parallels to Spanish claims about liberating oppressed peoples from Aztec tyranny. Critics argue that such interventions often served the interests of powerful nations rather than the welfare of local populations. The Aztec case shows how complex these moral calculations can be. Indigenous rights movements throughout the Americas draw on historical experiences of conquest and colonization to make claims about land, sovereignty, and cultural preservation. Understanding the specific historical context of these experiences is crucial for addressing contemporary challenges.
Academic understanding of the Aztec-Spanish encounter has evolved significantly over the past century. Early scholarship often portrayed the Aztecs as barbaric and the Spanish as civilizing forces. This narrative reflected European colonial attitudes rather than historical evidence. Mid-20th century scholarship began to recognize Aztec achievements and criticize Spanish brutality. This revisionist approach sometimes went too far in the opposite direction, romanticizing indigenous societies and ignoring their flaws and contradictions. Contemporary scholarship takes a more nuanced approach that recognizes both the achievements and limitations of all parties involved. This approach acknowledges the complexity of historical situations without imposing modern moral frameworks on past societies. How we teach the Aztec-Spanish encounter has important implications for how students understand history, culture, and ethics. Simplistic narratives that portray one side as entirely good and the other as entirely evil fail to capture the complexity of historical reality. Students need to understand that all historical societies had both positive and negative aspects. The Aztecs created remarkable achievements in urban planning, agriculture, and governance, while also practicing human sacrifice. The Spanish brought useful technologies and ideas, while also engaging in brutal exploitation. Critical thinking skills are essential for understanding complex historical situations. Students should learn to evaluate evidence from multiple sources, consider different perspectives, and recognize the limitations of historical knowledge. These skills are valuable for understanding contemporary issues as well as historical ones. Ongoing archaeological work continues to reveal new information about Aztec society and the Spanish conquest. Advanced technologies like ground-penetrating radar and DNA analysis are providing insights that were impossible with earlier methods. Indigenous language sources are being translated and analyzed by scholars who understand the cultural context of these documents. This work is recovering indigenous perspectives that were previously lost or ignored. Comparative studies with other historical encounters are revealing patterns and variations in how different societies have dealt with cultural contact and conflict. These studies help us understand the specific factors that shaped the Aztec-Spanish encounter. The story of the Aztec-Spanish encounter is not finished. New evidence continues to emerge that challenges existing assumptions and interpretations. Indigenous communities continue to recover and preserve their cultural heritage. The moral questions raised by this encounter remain relevant to contemporary debates about justice, power, and cultural difference. Understanding this complex historical situation requires us to move beyond simple narratives of good versus evil. It requires us to recognize the humanity of all participants while acknowledging the real suffering and achievements of different groups. It requires us to learn from the past without being trapped by it. The blood that stains the stones of Tenochtitlan's temple is a reminder of the terrible price that human societies have often paid for power and survival. But it is also a reminder of human resilience, creativity, and capacity for both destruction and renewal. The story continues to unfold in the lives of people throughout the Americas who carry forward the complex legacy of this encounter.
The question of whether Aztec rule was justified may never have a definitive answer, but the process of asking this question and seeking evidence to support different interpretations is itself valuable. It teaches us to think critically about power and justice, to understand different cultural perspectives, and to recognize the complexity of human behavior. These lessons are essential for building a more just and understanding world.